The Dark Psychology of Adolf Hitler. Why millions followed a failed artist. (1907). A 19-year-old boy stands outside an ornate stone building. In his hands, a portfolio of paintings. In his chest, an absolute, consuming certainty that he is extraordinary. The door opens. The door closes. 4 sentences. That is all the rejection letter contained. 4 sentences that the admissions committee of the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts wrote without drama, without cruelty, and without the faintest awareness of what they were setting into motion. Nuremberg. 1934. 300,000 people stand in perfect geometric formation beneath a cathedral of light. 60 searchlights aimed straight at heaven. And at the center of it all, one man. His voice rising. The crowd's arms rising with it. Their faces. And this is the part that should unsettle you, their faces are not afraid. They are ecstatic. They have surrendered something, their judgment, their individuality, their conscience, and they look relieved to have done it. Berlin. April, 1945. 50 feet underground. Concrete walls sweating with condensation. The smell of diesel exhaust and slow decay. A man sits hunched over a map table, his left hand shaking uncontrollably, his eyes fixed on divisions that no longer exist, issuing commands to armies already dead. Above him, Soviet artillery is reducing the capital of his 1,000-year empire to medieval rubble. He has been injected, this morning, with methamphetamine. And oxycodone. And something his doctor calls a vitamin compound that is neither vitamin nor compound in any meaningful sense. The boy who needed the world to call him a genius has become this. The question, the only question that matters, is how. Chapter 1, The Narcissistic Injury. Let us begin with the paintings. Because the paintings tell us everything, if you know how to look. Adolf Hitler produced hundreds of watercolors across his lifetime, architectural studies, Viennese streetscapes, postcard reproductions of famous landmarks. The technical execution is adequate. Not inspired, not visionary, but adequate enough that when his works are auctioned today, they sell for tens of thousands of dollars, purchased not for their artistic merit, but for their biographical horror. But here is what the art tells us that the history books often miss. There are almost no people in them. Street after street, building after building, rendered with careful, almost compulsive attention to architectural detail. And yet the world he painted is empty. Evacuated. On the rare occasion a human figure does appear, it is reduced to an indistinct smudge, a compositional placeholder, a shadow with no interior life. For a young man who desperately wanted entry into the world of art, the world of human feeling and human expression, he produced work that was, psychologically speaking, a portrait of profound disconnection. He could not render human beings because, on some fundamental level, he could not see them. The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts rejected his application in 1907. They rejected it again in 1908. The second rejection hit harder, because by then his mother, Clara Hitler, the one person in the world toward whom he appears to have felt genuine, uncomplicated love, had died of breast cancer. He was 19 years old, newly orphaned, twice rejected, and utterly alone in a city that had no interest in him whatsoever. To understand what this did to his psychology, you need to understand what psychologists mean by the term. Narcissistic injury. What happens when a person who has constructed their entire identity around a belief in their own exceptional greatness encounters a reality that refuses to confirm it? The response is not grief. It is not humility. It is rage. Directed outward. Always outward. Hitler did not conclude, after his second rejection, that perhaps he was not the artist he believed himself to be. He concluded that the world was corrupt. That the evaluators were biased. That forces beyond his understanding were conspiring to deny a genius his rightful recognition. He was, in other words, building a persecutory narrative, a cognitive framework in which every failure becomes evidence of external conspiracy rather than internal limitation. It protects the ego at catastrophic cost to reality. He would spend the next 3 decades expanding it until it was large enough to cover an entire continent. Then came the war. In August 1914, Adolf Hitler enlisted in the German army with what witnesses described as something close to joy. For Hitler, the war offered something the civilian world had denied him entirely: structure, purpose, and belonging. He was, by most accounts, a dedicated and even brave soldier. He was wounded. He was decorated. He found, in the rigid hierarchy of military life, the identity that Vienna's coffeehouses had refused to give him. And then Germany surrendered. And something in him, something already cracked, broke completely. Here we must introduce a concept developed by the psychoanalyst Anna Freud. Identification with the aggressor, the psychological mechanism by which a person who has been humiliated and rendered powerless does not identify with the victim. They identify with the one who did the humiliating. They internalize the aggressor's power and turn it outward, replicating the original violence at ever larger scale. Hitler had been humiliated by Vienna. By rejection. By poverty. By anonymity. And now his entire nation had been humiliated, stripped, in the Versailles Treaty, of territory, sovereignty, and moral standing. Germany had suffered, collectively, the same narcissistic injury he had suffered personally. He recognized it in his bones. And he knew exactly what to do with it. Chapter 2, The Alchemy of Mass Control. To understand how Adolf Hitler sees the psychology of an entire nation, you need to first understand the condition of that nation. Weimar Germany in the early 1920s was a country in genuine psychological crisis. The economy was in freefall. At the peak of hyperinflation, a single loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Veterans who had survived years in the trenches returned to find unemployment, social chaos, and a democracy that most Germans associated not with freedom, but with the humiliation of surrender. A nation, in other words, had been made to feel small. And a nation that has been made to feel small is extraordinarily vulnerable to a specific kind of manipulation. Collective narcissism. The shared belief that one's group is exceptional, uniquely victimized, and dangerously unrecognized by the world. Research consistently shows that populations experiencing collective narcissism are disproportionately drawn to authoritarian figures, not despite their extremism, but because of it. Because the extreme leader offers the one thing the wounded collective ego cannot generate for itself. A story in which they are the heroes. Hitler's gift. And we must be coldly precise about this, because it was a gift, however monstrous its application, was his ability to provide that story with total, overwhelming conviction. His rally settings were engineered environments, the darkness, the torchlight, the synchronized movement, the music, the architectural scale of the spaces he chose, all designed to systematically dismantle the individual's critical faculties before he said a single word. By the time Hitler stepped to the podium at Nuremberg, his audience was already neurologically primed for submission. Then he would begin to speak. And here is where the concept of emotional contagion, the largely involuntary process by which human beings synchronize their emotional states with those around them, driven by mirror neuron systems that underpin empathy. In crowds of 300,000, systematically manipulated, it becomes a psychological wildfire. Hitler understood this intuitively. He would begin quietly, almost hesitantly, drawing the crowd into anxious attention. Then he would build, rhythmically and relentlessly, his voice rising and falling with the precision of a conductor, reaching crescendos of righteous denunciation that gave the crowd the neurochemical experience of collective catharsis. They were not just agreeing with him. They were feeling what he felt. But the emotional manipulation was only half the architecture. The other half was the lie. And not merely lies, a specific, clinical category of deception. Pseudologia fantastica / the big lie, the principle that the larger the lie, the more effectively it bypasses skepticism. A lie of sufficient scale is too vast for ordinary critical thinking to fully engage with. It overwhelms the fact-checking instinct. It feels, paradoxically, more credible precisely because no one, surely, would fabricate something so enormous. He told Germany that its defeat in World War I had not been military. It had been a stab in the back, an internal betrayal by enemies within. He named those enemies with absolute certainty, without evidence, and with the passionate conviction of a man who had spent years constructing a persecution narrative complex enough to satisfy his own psychology. And here we encounter the third and perhaps most disturbing mechanism in his arsenal. Shadow projection. Carl Jung's concept of the shadow describes the repository of everything we refuse to acknowledge in ourselves, our weakness, our failure, our shame. What we cannot own, we project outward. We locate in others the darkness we cannot face in the mirror. Hitler was a failed man who could not tolerate failure. He was a man of profound psychological fragility who preached iron strength. Everything he could not be, he projected outward, and then destroyed. And Germany, collectively, followed him into that destruction. Because the shadow projection was not his alone. It was shared. He had given an entire nation permission to externalize its self-loathing, and to call the act of persecution justice. This is how a failed postcard seller became the most dangerous man of the 20th century. Not through force. Through psychology. Chapter 3, The Chemical and Mental Collapse. Now we go underground. 50 feet beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden in Berlin, the Führerbunker was completed in 1944, 18 small rooms encased in concrete 4 meters thick, connected by narrow corridors and lit entirely by artificial light. It smelled of diesel exhaust, mildew, and the peculiar medicinal staleness of a place sealed against the outside world. The ventilation fans ran continuously. A constant mechanical hum that filled the silences between the distant detonations of Soviet artillery, which by January 1945 could be felt as vibrations in the floor. Adolf Hitler moved into the bunker in January 1945. He would not leave it alive. Dr. Theodor Morell had been Hitler's personal physician since 1936. His methods were, by any legitimate medical standard, somewhere between reckless and criminal. He administered injections, sometimes multiple times daily, whose compound list reads like the inventory of a pharmaceutical catastrophe. Methamphetamine. Then marketed under the trade name Pervitin, administered intravenously to combat fatigue and produce artificial states of energy and confidence. Oxycodone for pain. Barbiturates for sleep. Cocaine eye drops for sinus conditions. A preparation called Vitamultin, which contained methamphetamine in tablet form. Hormonal extracts. Enzyme preparations. By 1944, Hitler was displaying symptoms consistent with severe, chronic amphetamine psychosis. Grandiose ideation, paranoid ideation, explosive rage disproportionate to stimulus, and a profound and accelerating disconnection from consensual reality. He was not simply making bad decisions. His neurochemistry had been so comprehensively altered that his capacity to process accurate information had been structurally compromised. He was, in the most clinical sense of the word, no longer sane. What the bunker testimonies describe is a portrait of psychological disintegration so complete it would be almost pitiable, were it not attached to the ongoing murder of millions. He slept until noon and often did not emerge until late afternoon. His left hand trembled, possibly Parkinson's disease, potentially exacerbated by years of amphetamine use. He walked in a shuffle, his spine bent, his face a mask of gray exhaustion punctuated by sudden, terrifying eruptions of rage. At the daily military conferences, held around a large map table, the ventilation fans providing their constant, indifferent hum, he would issue commands to army groups that had ceased to exist. He would insist on counteroffensives from divisions that were already encircled and destroyed. When generals presented accurate intelligence, that the situation was irreversible, that Berlin would fall, he would accuse them of treason, cowardice, and deliberate sabotage. The persecutory narrative he had first constructed in a Viennese homeless shelter in 1909 had expanded, finally, to fill even this sealed concrete room. Everyone was betraying him. Everyone had always been betraying him. The failure was never his. It was never his. On April 22, 1945, with Soviet forces entering the city, Adolf Hitler had what witnesses describe as his final psychological collapse. He screamed. For an extended period, in front of his assembled staff, he raged. At the generals, at the Wehrmacht, at the German people themselves, whom he now declared had proven themselves unworthy of his vision and deserved their destruction. It is a moment of extraordinary, chilling revelation. Because in that room, in that outburst, you can hear clearly, across 80 years, the 19-year-old boy in Vienna, standing outside the academy. The world had failed him again. And again, it would pay. Conclusion, the full circle. On April 30, 1945, at approximately 3:30 in the afternoon, Adolf Hitler died by his own hand in a private study of the Führerbunker. He did not fight to the last, as he had demanded of millions of others. He did not surrender and face the judgment of the world he had devastated. He chose, as he had perhaps always chosen, since the moment the Vienna Academy closed its doors, to exit before the verdict could be delivered. The failed artist's final act was not an act of defiance. It was an act of avoidance. The Vienna Academy of Fine Arts still stands. In its admissions archive, there is a record, clinical, administrative, entirely without drama, noting that the application of one Adolf Hitler was reviewed and declined on the grounds of insufficient figure-drawing ability. He could not render human beings on canvas. He spent the next 38 years rendering them in blood. What happened between that rejection letter and that bunker is not a story about evil descending from nowhere. It is a story about the human psyche, about what happens when profound personal failure meets grandiose self-concept, when narcissistic injury is left to fester without accountability, when shame is never processed inward but always projected outward. It is a story about what manipulation looks like when it finds the perfect host. A humiliated population, a broken economy, a collective identity in desperate need of a story in which it is the protagonist. And this is what Psychology Vault exists to examine. Not to provide comfort. Not to make the darkness comprehensible in ways that diffuse it. But to make it recognizable. Because the mechanisms that built the Third Reich, emotional contagion, collective narcissism, the big lie, shadow projection, the weaponization of shared shame. These mechanisms did not die in a Berlin bunker in 1945. They are available. They are operational. And they are being used. The most dangerous person in any room is not the one with the loudest voice. It is the one who knows what you are most afraid of. And has decided to use it. This has been Psychology Vault. Stay curious. Stay critical. And stay awake. Psychology Vault for educational use only.